But I think, well, we live in a society in which people's targets at a company have to do with next quarter revenue, year-on-year growth. National targets have to do with increases in percent of GDP, trade deficits, and politicians' performance targets have a great deal to do with the next election. And I think that's just a reality that we have to understand about their motivations. And so what do we say when, of course, some of this evidence, which is so crucial, is bound to play out over much longer time frames, where a policy decision now will potentially improve the health of people vastly in 10 years or 20 years from now? What's the clincher to make that work for someone who's thinking about, next year's by-election or next year's performance targets?
It's a very good question, and I think it's you've very clearly articulated one of the major challenges of making this kind of change that really is generational change. It's long-term change in thinking. That upstream planning means you're not always responding to the crisis of the moment, which is really where the news story is, maybe where the votes are. You're having to put some resources on dealing with the current crisis, but also redirect some to things that have a way longer term payout. One example of something that happened here in Ontario that I thought was really interesting is the investment in early childhood development. Now, there's quite a lot of money has been put into early childhood development here in Ontario, and that's the sort of thing, 4-year-olds don't vote. The returns on that are really long term. But really, the way that came about, the way that the government was convinced to do that, was a very intentional campaign. And some folks might know the name Charles Pascal, who formerly within the ministry, now a professor at U of T. And one of the things he talks about is the use of story hosts. So I think two concepts that come to mind. One is actually tell this story, actually have some courage to talk about upstream. And one of the responses that I see the most often, whatever kind of audience I'm talking to, whether it's doctors or farmers or folks interested in the Douglas Coldwell Foundation, when that upstream story comes up, their heads nod. It just makes sense. It makes so much sense. So being deliberate about talking about generational change, talking about upstream decision making is part of it, because if you avoid that conversation, then you're stuck always within the crisis. So some of it is framing. But the other is finding the right voices. So he uses the example of a former president of the Royal Bank who he met with, who was really interested in this early childhood development, and who he then dragged along to every meeting with every Chamber of Commerce because he spoke the language of the audience. And that's one of the things when we're trying to do the communication of these concepts, is trying to figure out who's listening and not just be pure laine about it, stuck to we must say it a specific way, but actually finding out what's the language that they speak, what is going to appeal to their desires, and really design our message still fitting with what we're trying to say, but in a way that they'll actually hear.